Every night, a small dog would curl up outside the local hospital, enduring the cold and dark in silence. But the true reason behind his behavior would bring tears to those who discovered it. Dr. Samuel Blackwell, a dedicated pediatrician, was one of the first to notice this little dog. When he uncovered the heartbreaking truth about the dog's loyalty and loss, he couldn't help but break down in tears. It was a cold winter evening, and the golden glow of the hospital lights reflected off the icy pavement. The usual rush of patients and visitors filled the front entrance, all wrapped in coats and scarves to shield themselves from the biting cold. But there, amidst the hustle and bustle, was a small dog with tangled fur and exhausted eyes, huddled at the revolving doors of the hospital. Despite the freezing temperatures, the dog didn't seek warmth or food. Instead, he sat quietly, staring at the entrance as though waiting for someone. Dr. Samuel Blackwell, known for his no-nonsense attitude and focus on his work, noticed the little dog as he was leaving the hospital. The dog's unwavering gaze held him for a moment, and he stopped in his tracks. "What is he doing here?" Dr. Blackwell muttered to himself, adjusting his scarf. A nurse passing by overheard and replied, "He's been here for weeks. Every night, they say he's waiting for someone. Someone inside." The doctor raised an eyebrow. Intrigued, who could the dog be waiting for? Was it a patient in the hospital? Someone sick, or perhaps even someone who had passed? The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. There was something in the dog's eyes, a story of loss, of longing, that Dr. Blackwell couldn't quite understand. The next day, the doctor left the hospital again, and as expected, the little dog was still there. Snowflakes began to fall, dusting the dog's fur as he remained in his spot, motionless, staring intently at the hospital's doors. Dr. Blackwell approached cautiously, unsure of how to interact with the animal. He wasn't particularly fond of dogs, nor did he have time for them. But there was something about this one. He bent down a few feet from the dog, his breath forming a white cloud in the cold air. "Are you still here?" he asked softly. The dog lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching, but didn't approach. His eyes, full of emotion, locked with Dr. Blackwell's, and the doctor could feel a lump form in his throat. The dog was clearly waiting for someone important. Just then, the night's janitor, who had been watching from a distance, approached, broom in hand. "That dog's been here for weeks, Doc," he said. "They say he's waiting for someone. For a patient." Dr. Blackwell's mind raced as he wondered if the dog's owner might be in one of the sterile hospital beds. Or worse, if they had already passed away, leaving the dog behind. The thought weighed heavily on him. Over the following nights, Dr. Blackwell found himself becoming more and more drawn to the dog. Each evening, when he left the hospital, the dog was always there, sitting in silence, never barking or begging. He was simply waiting. One particularly cold evening, unable to bear the sight of the trembling dog any longer, Dr. Blackwell returned to his car and retrieved a small blanket. He approached the dog carefully and draped it over him, speaking softly, "Here, this will help." To his surprise, the dog accepted the blanket, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was a brief flicker of trust in the dog's gaze, as if he knew the doctor wasn't a threat. The image of the dog remained with Dr. Blackwell that night, and the next day, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Something told him that the dog wasn't just waiting for a lost owner, it was waiting for closure. Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Blackwell began asking around the hospital, inquiring if anyone had reported a missing dog or if there was any clue as to the animal's origins. But no one had answers. As the days passed, his curiosity grew into a quiet determination. What had happened to this dog's owner? What was it that had caused such loyalty and devotion in such a small creature? He had to know. Little did Dr. Blackwell know, the answer would be much more emotional than he could ever have imagined. Dr. Samuel Blackwell couldn't stop thinking about the little dog outside the hospital. Every time he left work, the dog would still be there, sitting quietly by the doors, never asking for food or attention, only staring at the hospital entrance. It was as though he had a singular purpose, and that purpose was to wait. As the days passed, the dog's presence became a constant in San Francisco's chilly winter evenings. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Dr. Blackwell first noticed the dog, and with each passing day, he became more invested in the mystery surrounding him. The bond between them grew silently but surely. The doctor had never been an animal lover. But this dog, this small, quiet creature, had something special about him that Dr. Blackwell couldn't ignore. One evening, as Dr. Blackwell was heading home, he noticed the dog again, curled up beneath the small blanket he had brought the night before. The dog's eyes, still intense but somehow softer, looked up as the doctor approached. This time, Dr. Blackwell didn't hesitate. He squatted down beside the dog, his fingers brushing the fur on the dog's back as he spoke. "Hey, little guy," Dr. Blackwell whispered, "you still waiting?" The dog raised his head but didn't move. His eyes locked on the hospital doors once more. Dr. Blackwell sighed deeply, a heavy weight on his chest. He had to know more. That night, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He would go to the San Francisco Animal Shelter and see if they had any record of a missing dog. Maybe this little dog had been reported as lost. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who was looking for him. The next day, Dr. Blackwell visited the shelter. Hoping for answers, he spoke with a kind woman named Sarah, who had worked there for years. As he explained the situation, she listened intently, her brow furrowing in concern. "You said this dog's been outside the hospital for weeks now?" Sarah asked. "Yes," replied Dr. Blackwell, nodding. "He never moves, just sits there, waiting. I'm trying to figure out why." After some thought, Sarah led Dr. Blackwell to the back of the shelter. She opened a door to a small room, where a few more dogs were housed. And there, in the corner, was the same dog he had seen night after night. Dr. Blackwell was taken aback at how different the dog looked up close. He seemed so small, fragile, and vulnerable. His fur was matted and dirty, and his eyes were full of sadness. Yet there was a flicker of hope in them. Sarah gently spoke. "This dog's name is Max. He was brought here a while back after being found in the streets. But he's been around for so long. It's like he's waiting for someone. A family or maybe a person?" Dr. Blackwell knelt down and held out his hand to the dog, who hesitated but then cautiously sniffed it. It was as if he recognized him. But still, he remained distant. Dr. Blackwell's heart sank. Why was he waiting? Who had left him? And why was he so loyal, even in the face of abandonment? "Do you know anything about his history?" Dr. Blackwell asked. Sarah shook her head. "We don't have much on him. No one has come forward to claim him. His collar had no tags when he was found, and his microchip was never registered. He's been here for months. A lot of the staff think he's just waiting for his owner to return." Dr. Blackwell thought about Max all the way back to his house. The dog's story was unfolding, piece by piece, and it was a tragic one. He couldn't get the image of Max out of his mind, so devoted, so faithful, waiting for someone who might never come back. Over the next few days, Dr. Blackwell couldn't stop himself from visiting Max. Every night, after his long shifts at the hospital, he'd drive to the shelter and spend time with the dog. He brought him food, and little by little, Max began to trust him. He would allow Dr. Blackwell to pet him and even wagged his tail once or twice. Though it was clear that he was still in mourning, Dr. Blackwell would sit beside him, watching him with a deep sense of sorrow and empathy. But one evening, as he was leaving the shelter after spending some time with Max, something happened that changed everything. Max didn't follow him out as usual. Instead, he stayed, sitting near the door as if waiting for something, someone. "Max," Dr. Blackwell whispered, turning back toward the dog. "You're not alone anymore." It was then that Dr. Blackwell realized what he had to do. He couldn't let this dog wait forever. Max deserved a home, a family. He had already given so much, waiting for someone who might never return. The next day, Dr. Blackwell returned to the shelter and asked Sarah if he could adopt Max. The answer came quickly, with a warm smile from Sarah. "Of course, Dr. Blackwell. He deserves someone like you." Dr. Blackwell didn't waste a moment. He took Max home that afternoon, determined to give him the life he deserved, a life where he wouldn't have to wait anymore. That night, as Max lay in his new bed, the two of them stared out the window together, a quiet understanding passing between them. Neither of them was alone anymore. And so, Dr. Samuel Blackwell and Max began their new journey together, a journey of healing, companionship, and the promise of never having to wait again. Dr. Samuel Blackwell had never known the kind of peace that filled his home now that Max was with him. The little dog had been through so much in his life. Yet he seemed to be adjusting to his new life with Dr. Blackwell in San Francisco. Every morning, Max would sit by the window, watching the world outside as if awaiting something. But for the first time in a long while, there was no longer an aching look in his eyes, only curiosity. Dr. Blackwell had never been the type to allow emotions to get the best of him. But Max's quiet presence had begun to fill the void he didn't even realize existed. Every evening, after his long shifts at the hospital, Dr. Blackwell would come home to find Max waiting for him by the door, his tail wagging furiously as if greeting him like an old friend. It was the kind of unconditional loyalty that made Dr. Blackwell rethink everything he had believed about companionship. One afternoon, as Dr. Blackwell walked home from the hospital, he decided to take Max for a walk in Golden Gate Park. He had seen the park many times before, but today, the idea of walking there with Max felt different. There was something about the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the winding paths that made it seem like the perfect place to begin a new chapter. Max trotted beside him, his paws making soft sounds against the dirt path, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Looks like we're doing this, huh?" Dr. Blackwell muttered, looking down at Max, who had been by his side through thick and thin. Max's ears perked up, and he quickened his pace, as if responding to the doctor's words, his body language confident and relaxed. As they walked through the park, Dr. Blackwell couldn't help but think of the bond that had developed between them so quickly. He had always been a man of logic and reason, but Max had brought something different into his life, something raw and real. With each step, Dr. Blackwell felt the weight of his own struggles, his sense of isolation, lift just a little more. Max wasn't just a dog, he was the friend that Dr. Blackwell had never known he needed. As they reached a quieter area of the park, near the Golden Gate Bridge, they sat on a bench together, enjoying the view. Max rested his head on Dr. Blackwell's lap, his body still, as the wind blew softly through the trees. The sound of the city felt miles away, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was in this peaceful moment that Dr. Blackwell's thoughts drifted back to the first time he had seen Max sitting outside the hospital doors. Night after night, he remembered the look in the dog's eyes, the pain, the loss, the desperate hope. Now, as he stroked Max's fur, he realized just how much this little creature had gone through, and how much he had given to Dr. Blackwell without asking for anything in return. "Max," Dr. Blackwell whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you've taught me more than anyone else ever could. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." In that moment, the two of them seemed to communicate without words. Max's eyes, full of quiet wisdom, met Dr. Blackwell's, as though acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. For the first time in a long time, Dr. Blackwell felt complete. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The next morning, as Dr. Blackwell was finishing his shift at the hospital, he received an unexpected call. The shelter had contacted him with some important information about Max's past. He hadn't thought much about the dog's history since he'd brought him home. But now it seemed that the truth was finally coming to light. When Dr. Blackwell arrived at the shelter later that day, Sarah, the kind-hearted woman who worked there, greeted him. She seemed excited, but also somewhat apprehensive. Dr. Blackwell, sensing that something was about to change, approached her with a mix of curiosity and concern. "We've found something," Sarah began, holding up a small, folded piece of paper. "It's an adoption record for Max. It was filed years ago, but we only just found it now. The man who adopted him, Edward Langley, hasn't been seen for a while." The name Edward Langley sounded familiar, but Dr. Blackwell couldn't quite place it. He scanned the paper, his heart sinking as he read the details. Max had been adopted by Edward Langley when he was just a pup, and the man had been his faithful owner ever since. But the record showed something more. Edward Langley had passed away several weeks before Max had shown up at the hospital. The thought hit Dr. Blackwell like a punch to the stomach. "No wonder he's been waiting," Dr. Blackwell muttered to himself. "He's been waiting for Edward to come back." But Edward was gone, and now Max was left to mourn the loss of his best friend. It was clear that Max hadn't just been waiting for any person, he had been waiting for Edward. His loyalty, his unwavering devotion, it all made sense now. He hadn't been waiting for someone to take him in, He had been waiting for the one person who meant everything to him. With this new knowledge, Dr. Blackwell realized something important. He couldn't let Max carry this burden alone. Max had been through enough, and it was time for him to heal. Dr. Blackwell made a promise to the dog that day. A promise that he would never let him wait again. He would be Max's new family. And together, they would begin a new chapter. As Dr. Blackwell and Max left the shelter that day, walking side by side into the future, the dog's tail wagged for the first time in a long while. They had both lost so much, but they had also found something that was theirs. Something that could not be broken. A bond that would last a lifetime. And in that moment, in the heart of San Francisco, Dr. Blackwell knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that neither of them would face alone. As days turned into weeks, Dr. Samuel Blackwell found himself growing more attached to Max than he had ever imagined possible. The little dog had quickly become not just a companion, but a part of him, something he could rely on after years of emotional isolation. It wasn't just the loyalty that had captivated him, but the silent understanding between them. Max had taught him more about life and love than his many years of practice as a pediatrician ever had. Every day, after finishing his long shifts at the hospital in San Francisco, Dr. Blackwell would return to his apartment to find Max waiting by the door. The dog had become his anchor, offering a kind of emotional stability that had been missing from his life for so long. Max had an uncanny way of knowing when Dr. Blackwell needed comfort. Sitting silently by his side or resting his head on his lap, offering companionship without the need for words. One evening, after a particularly long and draining day at the hospital, Dr. Blackwell decided to take Max for a walk around Golden Gate Park. The air was cool and crisp, and the park, though busy with people, felt peaceful under the soft light of the setting sun. As they walked along the familiar path, Max stayed close to Dr. Blackwell, his tail wagging with a quiet excitement. There was something serene about these walks. And for the first time, Dr. Blackwell began to feel that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he once thought. As they reached the end of the park near the Golden Gate Bridge, Dr. Blackwell stopped and sat on a bench, taking in the view. The orange and pink hues of the sunset reflecting off the water below created a perfect moment of peace. He could feel Max by his side, his presence reassuring and grounding. "You know, Max," Dr. Blackwell began, his voice soft as he absent-mindedly stroked the dog's fur. "I never really understood the importance of loyalty. Not like I do now. You've taught me so much." Max turned his head and gazed up at him, his eyes full of trust and understanding. It was as if the dog knew exactly what Dr. Blackwell was thinking. And for a moment, there was nothing else, just the two of them, sharing a bond that couldn't be broken. As they continued their walks and settled into their new routine together, something began to change within Dr. Blackwell. The small, unspoken moments with Max filled him with a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. It wasn't just about caring for the patients at the hospital anymore. Now, he had a deeper connection, something he felt more strongly every day. Then, one cold morning, as Dr. Blackwell was reviewing patient charts at the hospital, he received an unexpected call. It was from the local animal shelter. The staff had found something, an old letter that had been left behind by Edward Langley, Max's original owner. The letter was handwritten, and the shelter staff had discovered it hidden in a box of items belonging to Edward. Curious, Dr. Blackwell made his way to the shelter during his lunch break. There, Sarah, the same nurse who had helped him previously, handed him the letter. "This," she said gently, "was in Edward's belongings. It's addressed to you, actually, or to whoever would take care of Max after him." With trembling hands, Dr. Blackwell opened the envelope and read aloud the words of Edward Langley. "My dear Max, if you are reading this, it means that I have already left this world. You were my constant companion, my reason to keep going during the hardest of times. I know this world can be cruel, but you were always there for me. And now, someone will be there for you. Please, find someone who will love you as much as I did. You deserve that." Reading Edward's heartfelt words brought tears to Dr. Blackwell's eyes. The realization hit him hard. Max had been through so much more than he ever could have imagined. He wasn't just a stray dog waiting for his lost owner, he was mourning. Just as Edward had. With that knowledge, Dr. Blackwell knew that he couldn't let Max be alone again. As much as the dog had healed him, it was now time for him to return the favor. That night, after work, Dr. Blackwell decided to take Max to Golden Gate Park once more. This time, he wasn't just walking through the park, he was taking a step towards something deeper. As they walked, the wind carrying the scent of the ocean, Dr. Blackwell felt a deep sense of connection, not just to Max, but to everything that had led them to this point. The park was quiet, and for once, it felt like the city was a world away. They reached the same bench where they had sat before, the Golden Gate Bridge standing majestically in the background. Max sat beside him, his head resting on Dr. Blackwell's lap, looking up at him with those familiar eyes filled with trust. "I'm not going to let you wait anymore," Dr. Blackwell whispered, his voice barely audible. "I promise you, Max, you have a home here now. And I'll be here for you. Just like you've been here for me." And so, the journey that had begun with uncertainty and loss now found its way to a new beginning. Dr. Blackwell and Max would face the world together. A doctor and his loyal companion, ready for whatever life would bring their way. San Francisco was their home, and their bond, forged in loyalty, would remain unshakable forever.